Hello everyone. Today we want to present our final project about business analytics. The title is Comparative Predictive Analysis of Economic Growth Drivers, Lesson Learned from China and Vietnam for Indonesia's Futures Development Sectors. This project created by Aditiyo Burhanudin Hakim, Andhika Wiraswastika, and myself, Aditya Nugraha. Over the past 2 decades, China and Vietnam has achieved rapid transformation through industrialization and export, while Indonesia's growth remains steady but less transformative. Our central question is, what truly drives sustained GDP growth? China and Vietnam succeeded with export-led manufacturing and strong FDI inflows. Indonesia remains resource-based and slower in high-value production. We aim to identify what Indonesia can learn and replicate from China and Vietnam. China and Vietnam succeeded with exported manufacturing and strong FDI inflows. Indonesia remains resource-based and slower in high-value production. We aim to identify what Indonesia can learn and replicate from those two. As you can see at the table, we still lag behind the FDI inflow, other than China and Vietnam's. China GDP growth is 5%, Vietnam's 6.9%, and Indonesia 5.1%. Vietnam leads in FDI and export, China in technology, while Indonesia relies on natural resources. Each has distinct path to growth. Our study built on 3 growth theories: Solo about the capital and labor, Romer about the innovation, and export-led growth trade-driven. We integrate this with machine learning approaches to forecast economic performances of Indonesia. Here is our analysis framework. First, we collect data from World Bank data about the China, Vietnam, and Indonesia during 1960 until 2024. After that, we do data extracting and data cleansing. The data size about 121K observation. Next, we do descriptive analysis using trends and patterns. Parallelly, we do comparative analysis using PCA, clustering, and gaps. After that, we do predictive modeling using lasso regression, ridge, and random forest. After that, after the predictive modeling, we use the forecasting Indonesia to 2025 until 2030 using 3 baseline. First is a baseline forecasting. Second is about the Vietnam path, following Vietnam path, and the reformation of economy. And to finish, we can publish the recommendation and insight. What can we found about this analysis framework? We use 3 machine learning approaches. The first is lasso regression. Second is random forest. And the third is ridge. After that, we do evaluation metrics using R-arm, SI, R squared, and MAA, mean absolute error. Here is our data specification. We use data from http://data.worldbank.org/country, which means we extract 3 data from 3 different countries, which mean China, Vietnam, and Indonesia itself. This data have 16 indicators each and have 3 sheets. The first sheet is data, the second sheet is metadata country, and the third sheet is metadata indicators. You can find the detail about the data inside the metadata indicators. Those 3 data is almost identical. As we can see, this data specification or data sheet details, we can see the indicator names, indicator code, and years. And the metadata indicators, we can see indicator code, indicator name, source node, and source organization. Here is the data primary indicator that we use to predict and we use during the analysis. The first is GDP and growth indicator, and the second is foreign direct investment data of FDI. The third is trade and export data. The fourth is industry and manufacturing data. The fifth, investment and capital formation data. The sixth, technology and digital infrastructure data. And the seventh is education and human capital data. Each data has variable mapping. This is the variable mapping that we use, and this is the data completeness by indicator. we already assessed the data completeness, and we already show in this data completeness by indicator. And then we do the main variables in analysis to determine which data as the main variable that using to our analysis. Here is the result and discussion. First, about the descriptive analysis. We have the summary statistic. The GDP growth champion is China with 8.19%, but FDI leader is Vietnam, almost 3.5 higher than Indonesia. But export champions is still in Vietnam with 70.3%. Indonesia's industry similarity between Indonesia and China is very similar, but very different in the composition, which means China mainly is about high-tech manufacturing and Indonesia about resource extraction. In the latest condition, we see Vietnam led by GDP growth and FDI. China, interestingly, lead in the internet. We have found the key finding from descriptive analysis. Indonesia problem is FDI is very low, which means 1.73%. Vietnam is 2.5 higher than Indonesia. And we experience manufacturing declining, export being very low, GDP growth very stagnant, and high-tech export is likely under 1%. We have a critical gaps, Indonesia versus others. There's almost everything we lag behind. The only advantage that Indonesians have is internet penetration is 78% versus China is 75%, which means we lead 5 points only, but this is not utilized. This is the plot result and visualization of the descriptive analysis. China experienced 179 times growth since 1978 reformation. Indonesia steady but slow. Vietnam lag behind, but rapid recent growth, we cannot take it easy. Vietnam spiked after 2007 WTO entry, but Indonesia stuck at 1 until 2%. This is the problems. We have alarms. Indonesia peaked at 2026. The most critical problem with the Indonesia biggest opportunity as the Indonesia is far behind in the high technology export. And the conclusion, Indonesia is stuck in the middle income trap because it failed to attract FDI and build manufacturing capabilities. What went well? Indonesia has decent internet infrastructure, GDP growth still positive, and industry stare similar to China. But critical problem is FDI too low, manufacturing declining, high-tech gap massive, export not diversified. Next, we use comparative analysis first about the hierarchical clustering analysis. China from separate cluster, advanced manufacturing economy, high-tech export leader, different development stage. And Indonesia and Vietnam grouped together, both emerging economies, but despite the clustering together, Indonesia and Vietnam very opposite moving direction. Vietnam ascending following China paths, Indonesia stagnating, stuck in the middle income trap. And the second one about the PCA, we see China is the first position, Vietnam in the second, Indonesia in the latest. And in the PC analysis on the PC2 at scale maturity axis, China has mature economy, Vietnam medium are scaling up, but Indonesia is underperforming. On the PCA biplot, we already know high-tech export is differentiator. Internet and FDI close behind after high-tech export. And the third position, manufacturing at least important for differentiation. Indonesia has lagged behind from those two. Next, we do gap analysis, which means we found several aspects that Indonesia has negative gap as a comparison between China and Vietnam. And then the comparative analysis, gap evolution over time has increased, which means Indonesia has manufacturing advantage in 2000s, but squandered it through premature deindustrialization. Vietnam now the manufacturing hub. Indonesia lacks in manufacturing, internet, and FDI. By the color pattern and heat map analysis, we see Indonesia is underperforming, Vietnam is outperforming, and China mixed because the mature economy. Next, we use radar chart by country performance profile, and we see Indonesia radar charts show extreme imbalance, hike on wrong things, exactly in the extractive industry, and low on the right things, manufacturing and digital. As a conclusion, there is a 4 critical problem identified. First, Indonesia have FDI growth, manufacturing decline, innovation vacuum, and digital gaps. As a conclusion of comparative analysis, there are 3 big stats that need to be put more attention. First is FDI gap, second is manufacturing gap, and third is GDP growth gap, which is shocking levels of manufacturing or percent GDP. In 2000, Indonesia lead Vietnam, but right now, 2024, Indonesia is behind Vietnam with total swing 14%. Next, we do predictive modeling. First step, we need additional datasheet to complete the modeling. The second is we running script and model performance. This is the model performance result, as you can see as the follow. We do model evaluation and we see random forest has an excellent status. There is no overfit ratio and has a test RMSE, and trend RMSE has the highest score. So by the model selection, we do random forest is the most trustworthy model because it doesn't overfit, it handles non-linear relationship effectively, and it's more stable across different data samples. And then we do the prediction and conclusion, and we already see the Indonesian performance only resulting error in 2020 because of COVID. And everything is working fine, and we have an error very low. Next step, after we do predictive modeling, we do forecasting, of course. We have 3 scenarios. First scenario is baseline, second is realistic reform, and third is Vietnam path. As you can see, with the average growth like shown in this slide, in 2023 growth, baseline will below 8% target. Realistic reform is almost approaching target, and Vietnam path near target. But this analysis forecasts Indonesia GDP growth under this distinct development path. Even the most aggressive Vietnam path scenario fails to achieve Indonesia 8% sustained growth target, reaching only 7.6% by 2030, with an average 6.5% over the forecast periods. As you can see, there is a critical insight. Even the most Vietnam path scenario still remain unachieved target. Here is the result of the forecasting about the Indonesia GDP growth forecast until 2030. This is Indonesia FDI trajectory in 2030. This is Indonesian manufacturing. This is Indonesia trajectory FDI and manufacturing. And this is a scenario comparison. You can see the detail. And the conclusion, if we want to follow baseline scenario, we must do business as usual with minor improvement, no major policy disruption, and gradual organic growth in key sector. But if we want to do realistic reform, the balanced strategy, we need to reform the FDI, manufacturing push, and export competitiveness. This is without a race here. This is if everything is come with race here. This is a risk and probability and bottom line about our current mission. But the best scenario is Vietnam path. We need to radical FDI liberalization. We need to push it until 150% in 2030. With the transformation, 26% of GDP, and export revolution, 40% of GDP. So we have the dimension for the recommendation as policy change required, investment needed, time to impact, political difficulty, bureaucratic resistance, private sector reforms. Here is the data from the baseline, realistic, and Vietnam. Here is the references, all the references that we use to make this project. Thank you so much for your attention. Have a nice day.